Why are you here? Those were the explosive words caught on a leaked recording as King Charles confronted Meghan Markle at the very heart of Buckingham Palace. In a stunning turn of events, a rare and secretly recorded clip has surfaced, capturing a tense face-off between King Charles and Meghan Markle right inside Buckingham Palace. The footage shows the king visibly frustrated, demanding answers from Meghan after her shocking, unannounced arrival. What led to this dramatic confrontation? Why did Meghan appear without warning, defying royal protocol? And what does this mean for the already fractured relationship between the Sussexes and the Crown? Stay with us as we unravel the truth behind this unprecedented showdown, the hidden tensions it exposes, and the potential fallout that could shake the monarchy to its core. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It was an unusually quiet morning at Buckingham Palace, the historic heart of the British monarchy, where centuries of tradition and power converge under one grand roof. The air was crisp, and the meticulously manicured gardens glistened under the early sun. Inside the palace, staff moved about with their usual quiet efficiency, attending to their duties with the precision that comes from years of practice. In the corridors lined with portraits of monarchs past, there was a distinct air of calm. No one could have predicted that within the next hour, this serenity would be shattered in a way that would leave everyone, both inside the palace and beyond, stunned. The royal family had been navigating turbulent waters for quite some time. With every passing week, new stories surfaced, often involving the younger members of the family and their modern, sometimes controversial, way of dealing with age-old traditions. The monarchy had always been about order, predictability, and maintaining the image of unwavering unity. Yet, this morning, all of that was about to be tested. Unbeknownst to everyone inside the palace, an unannounced visitor was making her way through the gates, a visitor who, over the past few years, had become synonymous with controversy and division, Meghan Markle. No one saw her coming. No official motorcade, no warning, and certainly no royal invitation. As the discreet black vehicle glided through the ornate gates of Buckingham Palace, a murmur of confusion spread among the guards. The uniformed men exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether to challenge the visitor or follow protocol, which mandated respectful distance unless instructed otherwise. As the car came to a halt in the inner courtyard, a figure stepped out, calm, composed, and determined. Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, had arrived, and she was here for a reason. For those within the palace, time seemed to slow down as word of Meghan's arrival spread. The first to notice were the security personnel, followed by the household staff who peeked through grand windows, whispering urgently among themselves. The tension was palpable. What could she possibly want? Why was she here without prior notice? These questions hung in the air as Meghan, unaccompanied, made her way toward the entrance, her expression resolute and unyielding. Inside the grand reception hall, the staff scrambled to compose themselves. One of the senior aides hurried to inform the private secretary, who in turn tried to reach King Charles. The new monarch, accustomed to balancing tradition with the unpredictable modern dynamics of his family, was preparing for a series of meetings in his private quarters. When his phone rang and the news was relayed, his reaction was one of sheer disbelief. In all his years navigating the public and private spheres of royal life, rarely had he been caught off guard quite like this. "What do you mean, she's here?" he demanded, his voice a mixture of irritation and disbelief. The aide repeated the information, hesitantly suggesting that perhaps Meghan had come to discuss a family matter. King Charles, however, was not convinced. In his mind, the lines between personal grievances and public perception were blurred, and this unplanned visit threatened to ignite a firestorm of speculation. As the king processed the situation, his thoughts raced. Since the dramatic departure of Harry and Meghan from royal duties, their sporadic interactions had been fraught with tension. There had been public statements, interviews, and headlines that painted both sides in less than flattering light. The memory of the explosive interview that aired worldwide was still fresh in his mind, where accusations and revelations had left the monarchy bruised and the public divided. Now, Meghan's sudden appearance at the very heart of the royal world seemed not just unexpected, but almost provocative. The minutes dragged on as staff members debated the best course of action. Should they invite her in? Should they turn her away? The hesitation stemmed not just from protocol, but from fear of making the wrong move that could be construed as either disrespect or capitulation. One wrong decision, and the monarchy could be engulfed in yet another scandal. When Meghan finally stepped into the reception hall, there was a moment of stillness. Dressed elegantly, her demeanor was calm but purposeful. A few staff members stole glances at one another, unsure whether to address her formally or simply nod in acknowledgement. Meghan, however, appeared unfazed by the awkwardness. She stood confidently, scanning the room as if searching for a familiar face. In the hallway leading to the main chamber, King Charles approached, his steps heavy with determination. As he turned the corner and spotted Meghan, his face hardened. For a brief moment, there was silence, an awkward, uncomfortable stillness that seemed to stretch far longer than it actually did. Then, in a voice laced with irritation and disbelief, King Charles broke the silence. "Why are you here?" The bluntness of his question cut through the tension like a knife. Meghan held his gaze, unflinching, as if bracing herself for whatever might come next. The king's tone, while controlled, revealed the underlying frustration of a man who had seen his family's name dragged through the mud, who had watched as the monarchy's image was reshaped and challenged from within. For him, Meghan's presence was not just an intrusion, it was a reminder of all that had gone awry. Meghan took a breath, as if carefully choosing her words. Those watching from a distance knew that whatever she said next could either calm the situation or escalate it to unmanageable proportions. Some of the aides, who had spent decades serving the royal family, could scarcely believe what they were witnessing. It was as if two worlds were colliding, one rooted in centuries of protocol and tradition, the other shaped by modern ideals of independence and self-expression. In the background, one of the senior advisors signaled to the press secretary, who immediately began drafting a statement, just in case this unexpected encounter turned into a public relations nightmare. But within the grand hall, the focus remained on the king and the duchess, locked in a tense, wordless standoff. As Charles awaited her response, his mind raced through possible explanations. Was this a calculated move? A personal plea? An attempt at reconciliation? Or was it something more strategic, aimed at leveraging public sentiment by catching the monarchy off guard? In that moment, as he searched her face for answers, it became clear that whatever had brought Meghan to the palace, it was bound to leave lasting ripples throughout the royal family and beyond. The confrontation had only just begun, but the ramifications would soon echo far beyond the ornate halls of Buckingham Palace, challenging the public's perception of duty, family loyalty, and the ever-evolving role of the modern monarchy. The silence that filled the grand hall of Buckingham Palace was heavy with tension. The few staff members who lingered nearby exchanged glances of disbelief and nervousness. This was not just a breach of protocol, it was a confrontation that no one had anticipated. Meghan Markle, standing poised and unyielding, was a stark contrast to the flustered aides who hovered at the edges of the room, unsure whether to step in or back away. King Charles, his expression a mixture of disbelief and thinly veiled frustration, took a step forward. His presence commanded the room. The years of regal bearing were evident in every movement. Yet there was something different this time, a crack in the carefully constructed mask of royal composure. His voice, sharp and measured, cut through the silence once again. "Why are you here?" he repeated, the words edged with incredulity. Meghan met his gaze unflinchingly, her eyes steady and composed. "I came to talk," she replied simply, her voice even. There was no tremor, no hint of hesitation. The simplicity of her statement was almost disarming. But the weight of those words hung in the air, laden with implications that neither of them seemed ready to unpack. The king's jaw tightened, and he glanced around the room as if searching for confirmation that this was really happening. He was met with downcast eyes and the shuffling of feet. No one dared to meet his gaze for long. Finally, he looked back at Meghan, his expression hardening. "Talk," he echoed, the word dripping with skepticism. "I believe you forfeited that privilege when you left." The tension in the room deepened, thick and suffocating. Meghan did not waver. If anything, she straightened her posture, her hands clasped calmly in front of her. "It's never too late to make things right," she said, her tone unwavering, almost defiant. King Charles's eyes narrowed slightly. His hands were clasped behind his back, his posture rigid with authority. "And you think a surprise appearance at Buckingham Palace is the way to do that?" he asked, his tone clipped. Meghan took a measured breath. "It's the only way I knew you would listen," she replied. Her voice was steady, but there was a glimmer of something deeper, perhaps desperation, perhaps resolve. It was difficult to tell, and King Charles wasn't sure he cared to decipher it. The senior aides hovered just out of earshot, their faces a blend of shock and dread. This was unprecedented, a royal appearing unannounced, bypassing protocol, and walking straight into the lion's den. For them, the very act defied not just tradition, but the rigid structure that had governed the monarchy for centuries. King Charles took another step forward, his gaze never leaving hers. "You realize what you've done, don't you?" he asked, his voice low and controlled. "Walking through those gates without invitation, without announcement, you've made a statement louder than any interview you've given." Meghan's expression remained unchanged. "I'm here to talk," she repeated, the words resolute. There was a flicker of something in King Charles's eyes, an emotion that came and went so quickly it was almost imperceptible. Anger? Regret? It was impossible to say. But whatever it was, it passed, replaced once again by the mask of royalty. "Very well," he said finally, his voice devoid of warmth. "Let's talk." The staff exchanged glances of disbelief as King Charles turned and led the way down the opulent corridor, his footsteps echoing off the marble floors. Meghan followed, her heels clicking in rhythmic precision, a symbol of defiance and grace. No one spoke as they walked, and the only sounds were the whispers that followed them, hushed and urgent. The two entered a private chamber, away from the prying eyes of staff and the looming portraits of past monarchs that adorned the palace walls. A pair of double doors closed behind them, sealing them off from the rest of the world. Whatever would be said inside that room would remain a mystery, at least for now. But outside, the palace was abuzz with speculation. Staff members whispered in corners, eyes wide with disbelief. The news spread quickly. Meghan Markle had arrived unannounced and was meeting privately with King Charles. It was a breach of tradition, a scandal in the making. For the royal aides, it was a crisis they had not anticipated. They scrambled to communicate with press officers, unsure of what statement, if any, should be released. In the media world, news of Meghan's arrival at Buckingham Palace had already begun to spread. Paparazzi had captured the black car slipping through the gates, and speculation was rampant. Was it a surprise visit? A confrontation? An attempt at reconciliation? Theories flew wildly across news desks and social media platforms, each one more sensational than the last. Inside the private chamber, the atmosphere was markedly different. The grandeur of the room did little to soften the tension that hung between them. King Charles stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the manicured gardens beyond, while Meghan remained standing near the entrance, her hands still folded neatly in front of her. "You've caused quite a stir," King Charles remarked, his back still turned. His voice was softer now, less harsh, though no less pointed. "I imagine that was part of the plan." Meghan didn't flinch. "I came here to speak, not to create chaos," she replied firmly. He turned then, his expression one of disbelief. "You walked through the gates of Buckingham Palace unannounced, and you think that wouldn't create chaos?" A pause hung in the air, weighted and significant. Meghan looked him in the eyes. "I had no choice," she said finally. Her voice was softer, almost pleading. "You wouldn't see me otherwise." King Charles studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. For a man who had spent his life in the public eye, whose every move was scrutinized and dissected, the idea of being confronted in his own home without the layers of protocol to shield him was unsettling. He was unprepared for the rawness of it, the simplicity of a family matter laid bare. "Perhaps you're right," he admitted quietly. His voice had lost its edge, replaced by something more reflective. "Perhaps we both failed to communicate." The admission hung in the air, fragile and tentative. Meghan took a step forward, the first movement she had made since entering the room. "That's why I'm here," she said, her tone softer now. "To fix things. Or at least try." King Charles regarded her for a long time, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. For once, there were no cameras, no reporters, no carefully scripted statements. It was just the two of them, father and daughter-in-law, separated by walls of tradition, misunderstandings, and public scandal. "I don't know if it can be fixed," he said finally, his voice heavy with years of unresolved conflict. "But I suppose we can start by talking." Meghan nodded slowly, her expression one of cautious optimism. "That's all I'm asking for." Outside the chamber, the palace continued its routine, unaware of the fragile attempt at reconciliation happening behind closed doors. But for those who had witnessed Meghan's unannounced arrival and King Charles's unexpected willingness to listen, it was a moment they would not soon forget. The royal family, once seen as unyielding and immovable, had just been shaken by a single act of defiance, and perhaps, just perhaps, a step toward healing had begun. The heavy oak doors of the private chamber shut with a low, resonating thud, leaving Meghan and King Charles alone in a silence that seemed to stretch on for miles. Outside, the palace staff moved quickly, heads bowed and voices hushed as they exchanged whispers of disbelief. No one could recall a moment quite like this, an unannounced visit by Meghan Markle, met not with a wall of royal protocol, but with direct confrontation from the king himself. It was a breach of tradition so staggering that many still struggled to comprehend it. Inside the chamber, the tension was thick, almost suffocating. The room itself was grand and imposing, with gilded mirrors reflecting the afternoon light that spilled in through tall windows. Portraits of monarchs long past lined the walls, their eyes fixed in perpetual judgment, watching the unfolding scene as if it were a spectacle meant for their own amusement. King Charles stood near the window, his back to Meghan, his hands clasped behind him in that familiar stance of authority. He gazed out over the perfectly manicured gardens of Buckingham Palace, though his thoughts were clearly elsewhere. The silence stretched, growing heavier with each passing second. Meghan remained standing by the entrance, her posture straight, her expression unyielding. She was determined, that much was clear. Whatever had driven her to arrive unannounced was powerful enough to withstand the palpable hostility emanating from the man who stood before her. Finally, King Charles turned to face her, his expression unreadable. His eyes, however, were sharp and focused. "I'm still waiting for an explanation," he said, his voice even but edged with the remnants of his earlier frustration. Meghan took a breath, steadying herself. She knew this was coming, had anticipated it. In fact, "I came to talk," she repeated, her voice unwavering. "I came because there are things that need to be said, things that haven't been addressed. And I believe it's time they are." King Charles raised an eyebrow, a flicker of skepticism crossing his features. "You think bursting into Buckingham Palace unannounced is the way to do that?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. Meghan did not flinch. "It was the only way I knew you would listen," she replied. "I tried before. I reached out, but I was ignored." Her eyes met his, and for a moment, there was a flash of vulnerability. A glimpse of the woman who had been shut out from the inner circles of power, left to navigate the storm of public scrutiny largely alone. The king regarded her carefully, his gaze assessing. "There are channels for communication," he replied slowly. "Proper channels. This," he gestured around the room, "is not one of them." Meghan's expression did not waver. "The proper channels are controlled," she replied firmly. "They're designed to keep people out, not bring them in. I needed you to hear me, not your advisors, not the press, just you." Her voice softened slightly, and the edge of defiance melted into something more genuine. "I wanted you to hear the truth. My truth." The room fell silent again, the weight of her words settling between them. For a man whose life had been dictated by order, tradition, and unyielding protocol, her candidness was both startling and, in a way, disarming. King Charles took a step closer, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And what truth is that, Meghan?" he asked, his tone challenging. "What truth justifies barging into this palace like you still belong here?" Meghan's eyes did not falter. "That we can't keep doing this," she said simply. "This back and forth, the headlines, the narratives, it's destroying us. It's destroying the family. And if it continues, I'm not sure there will be anything left to salvage." King Charles studied her for a long moment, his gaze searching her face for any sign of insincerity. "You expect me to believe that you came here for the good of the family?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of disbelief. "After everything? After what you've said, what you've done?" Meghan's expression tightened, but she did not look away. "Yes," she replied, her voice firmer now. "Because despite everything that has happened, this is still my family too. And I'm tired of fighting. Aren't you?" King Charles's eyes flashed with something close to anger. "You're tired of fighting?" he echoed, disbelief coloring his words. "You walked away. You chose to step back. And in doing so, you unleashed a wave of accusations that dragged this family through the mud. And now, you waltz back in here, unannounced, and want to talk about family." Meghan held his gaze, unyielding. "Yes," she replied, "because I know what it's like to be on the outside. I know what it's like to be vilified for simply existing. And I know that we can do better. We have to do better. For Archie, for Lilibet, for all of us." The mention of his grandchildren seemed to give King Charles pause. His eyes flickered, and his gaze softened, just for a moment. But just as quickly, his expression hardened once more. "You think you can just walk back in here and expect everything to be fixed?" he asked, his tone cutting. Meghan shook her head. "No," she replied softly. "I know it's not that simple. But I also know that nothing changes if we don't try. And I am willing to try." King Charles turned away, his hands returning to their familiar clasp behind his back as he faced the window once more. He said nothing for a long time, and Meghan did not press him. Outside, The gardens stretched out in pristine symmetry, the grass impossibly green, the flowers in perfect bloom. It was as if the world outside had not shifted, had not been upended by this single act of defiance. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, almost reflective. "You've made quite a mess," he murmured, his gaze still fixed on the gardens. "And you forced me to clean it up." Meghan took a step forward, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. "I'm not asking you to clean it up," she said quietly. "I'm asking you to help me fix it." King Charles turned to face her once more, his expression carefully guarded. "And what does that look like to you?" he asked, his tone neutral. Meghan hesitated for just a moment before speaking. "It looks like communication," she said firmly. "It looks like a setting aside the headlines, the interviews, the advisors, and just talking. Like we are right now." The king studied her, his expression unreadable. "And you believe that talking will solve everything?" he asked, his tone laced with skepticism. Meghan shook her head slowly. "No," she replied. "But it's a start." There was a long pause, and in that silence, something seemed to shift. The rigidness in King Charles's posture softened, if only slightly. He regarded her with a look that was neither acceptance nor rejection, but rather consideration. "You always did know how to make a statement," he said quietly, almost to himself. Meghan allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I suppose I did," she replied, her voice just above a whisper. King Charles turned back to the window, his gaze drifting to the gardens once more. Outside, the sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the palace grounds. "Very well," he said finally, his voice low and measured. "We'll talk. But understand this," he turned back to face her, his expression stern and resolute. "This cannot be another spectacle. If you are serious about this, you must be willing to do it my way. No more surprises. No more drama. Just the truth, as you said." Meghan nodded, her expression solemn. "I understand," she replied. King Charles gave a slow nod of acknowledgement. "Then let's begin," he said, motioning to the grand chairs positioned near the fireplace. And with that, the two of them took their seats across from each other, separated by years of conflict and misunderstanding, yet united, if only for this moment, by the possibility of reconciliation. The heavy silence that had settled between King Charles and Meghan in the private chamber was a fragile thing, delicate and tense, as if the slightest wrong word could shatter whatever fragile truce had just been established. The grand chairs near the ornate fireplace creaked slightly as they both settled in, their postures mirroring the guarded tension that hung in the room. King Charles leaned back, his hands folded neatly in his lap, while Meghan sat upright, poised, her gaze steady and unyielding. Outside the chamber walls, Buckingham Palace buzzed with quiet urgency. Aides moved swiftly through the halls, whispering hurriedly into communication devices, updating press secretaries and coordinating with the palace's security detail. Meghan's unannounced visit had thrown the royal machinery into overdrive. The Royal Communications Office scrambled to prepare statements, anticipating the inevitable media storm that would follow once the news broke. After all, nothing stayed secret for long, not within the gilded walls of Buckingham Palace. But inside the room, all of that felt distant and inconsequential. Here, there was only the two of them, King Charles, with the weight of centuries of tradition pressing down on his shoulders, and Meghan Markle, whose presence had redefined what it meant to be part of the royal family. She had come without an invitation, had walked through the grand gates unannounced, and now she sat across from the king himself, asking for something that had seemed impossible just hours before, a genuine conversation. King Charles watched her carefully, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "You said you came to talk," he began, his voice measured. "Talk, then." Meghan inhaled slowly, gathering her thoughts. She knew this moment was delicate, one misstep, and the walls would go back up, thicker and higher than before. "I came because I needed you to hear my side of the story," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "Not through the newspapers, not through the headlines, but from me. Directly." King Charles tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "And what exactly is your side of the story?" he asked, his tone carrying a note of skepticism. "I've heard it, Meghan. Everyone has. You made sure of that." Meghan did not flinch. "You've heard the media's version," she corrected. "You've heard the bits and pieces filtered through interviews and articles. But you haven't heard it from me. Not fully. Not without barriers." King Charles's gaze hardened, and he leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on hers. "And why now?" he asked, his voice sharper. "Why march into Buckingham Palace unannounced? You've had time, plenty of time, to reach out." Meghan's eyes did not waver. Because time was the problem, she replied. The longer we stayed silent, the bigger the divide grew. The more the media built narratives, the more entrenched they became. I couldn't just wait anymore. Not when everything was falling apart. A flicker of something crossed King Charles's face. Was it recognition? Understanding? It vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. And you believe you can fix this? He asked, his tone softening just slightly. You think sitting here, talking, is going to change everything that's been done? Meghan paused before answering, her hands clasped gently in her lap. I believe that if we don't try, then it's over. Completely. And I don't want that, she replied, her voice firm. No matter what has happened, I don't want that. King Charles regarded her carefully. There was a stillness in his gaze, a kind of contemplation that spoke of years of experience, of knowing when to listen and when to speak. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly under his weight. You think it's that simple? He asked finally. That we can just talk and everything will be fine? Meghan shook her head. No, she replied softly. But I think it's a start. Outside the chamber, the whispers grew louder. The palace staff moved with a kind of nervous energy, aware that something monumental was happening behind those closed doors. Inside, however, the world felt small and contained, just two people trying to bridge a chasm that had grown wider with each passing year. King Charles's gaze softened, just for a moment. You've caused quite a lot of trouble, he said, his voice almost reflective. You and Harry, it hasn't been easy. Meghan nodded, her expression somber. I know, she replied quietly. And I'm not saying I did everything perfectly. I'm not saying I didn't make mistakes. But I'm here because I want to move forward. And I think that can only happen if we try to understand each other. King Charles's eyes flickered with something that almost resembled sadness. And what is it you want me to understand, Meghan? He asked, his voice low. Because from where I'm sitting, it seems as though you've done everything possible to separate yourself from this family. Meghan met his gaze head on. That's not true, she replied firmly. I didn't separate myself. I was pushed out. Her voice was steady, but there was a tremor of emotion beneath the surface. I wanted to be part of this family. I wanted my children to know their heritage, to know their grandparents. But every step I took closer, I was pushed 2 steps back, until there was no more ground left to stand on. A silence stretched between them, thick and heavy with unspoken truths. King Charles's hands tightened slightly, the knuckles whitening as he absorbed her words. Pushed out, he repeated softly, almost to himself. His eyes drifted to the window, where the garden stretched out in neat, perfect lines, untouched by the storms that raged within these walls. Meghan leaned forward, her gaze steady. I'm not asking for perfection, she said, her voice quiet but insistent. I'm asking for a chance. A real chance. For Archie, for Lilibet, for Harry. For us to be a family. Isn't that what you want too? King Charles's gaze returned to hers, and for a moment, the walls he had so carefully constructed seemed to crack. It's not that simple, he replied, his voice carrying the weight of years of tradition and expectation. The world it watches. It judges. And every mistake, every misstep, it's magnified. Meghan nodded. I know, she replied. But isn't it worth trying? Isn't it worth fighting for? Even if it's hard? Even if it's complicated? The king did not answer immediately. His gaze drifted back to the window, his expression contemplative. Outside, the sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the palace grounds. I don't know, he said finally, his voice soft. I don't know if it can be fixed. Meghan's expression softened, her eyes bright with determination. But don't you want to try? She asked, her voice gentle. For them? For us? King Charles turned back to her, his gaze searching her face as if trying to find some hidden truth, some flicker of sincerity that had eluded him before. Finally, he nodded, almost imperceptibly. We'll try, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But it has to be different this time. It has to be real. Meghan nodded, her expression resolute. It will be, she promised. I'll make sure of it. For the first time since she had walked unannounced through the gates of Buckingham Palace, the tension in the room seemed to ease. There was still a long way to go, and the path would undoubtedly be fraught with obstacles, but it was a start. It was something, and sometimes that was all it took. The two of them sat in silence for a while, the weight of their words lingering in the air. Outside, the palace continued to buzz with whispers and speculation, but inside that chamber, there was a fragile, tentative understanding. Perhaps things could be different. Perhaps the bridges that had been burned could be rebuilt, but it would take time, and it would take trust. And perhaps, just perhaps, that trust had begun to form in the most unlikely of ways, through a surprise visit that no one, least of all King Charles, had seen coming. The room felt heavier with the passage of time, the kind of weight that can only come from unspoken truths and generations of tradition. King Charles remained seated by the window, his gaze still fixed on the gardens beyond. Meghan watched him carefully, her posture rigid but resolute. Outside, the world moved on, blissfully unaware of the fragile conversation unfolding behind the grand oak doors of Buckingham Palace. King Charles broke the silence first, his voice low and deliberate. "You know," he began, almost as if speaking to himself, "when I was a boy, I remember my mother telling me that the strength of the monarchy lies in its unity. That no matter what storms may rage outside, the family must remain steadfast, unyielding, unbroken." He turned back to face Meghan, his expression softened by memory. "But that's not what happened, is it?" Meghan's eyes softened. She saw, perhaps for the first time, not just the king, not just the figurehead of an empire, but a man, one who had lived through the turmoil of public scrutiny and private pain. "No," she replied gently. "That's not what happened." King Charles clasped his hands together, his knuckles white. "I wanted things to be different," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "When I became king, I wanted to bridge the gaps that had grown over the years. I wanted to bring this family back together. But instead, it fractured even more." Meghan hesitated, her eyes searching his face for traces of vulnerability. "It doesn't have to stay that way," she said finally, her voice steady. "We can change it. But it has to start with us, right here, right now." The king looked at her, his expression a mixture of skepticism and hope. "And you think it's that simple?" he asked, his voice edged with disbelief. "You think words can undo years of damage?" Meghan took a breath, her hands clasped firmly in her lap. "No," she replied. "I don't think it's simple, but I think it's necessary. I think if we don't try, then it only gets worse. And I don't want that. For my children. For your grandchildren. They deserve better." King Charles's eyes flickered with something, perhaps recognition, perhaps regret. "I haven't seen them," he murmured, almost as if speaking to himself. "Not properly. Not since, well, not since everything happened." Meghan nodded slowly, the weight of that truth pressing down on both of them. "That can change," she offered, her voice softening. "If we let it." He regarded her carefully, his gaze piercing but not unkind. "And what do you propose, Meghan?" he asked finally. "You've come all this way, walked through those gates unannounced, and now you're sitting in front of me asking for what exactly?" Meghan leaned forward slightly, her expression resolute. "I want us to try," she replied firmly. "I want us to set aside the headlines and the interviews and the advisors. I want us to meet. Just us. You, me, Harry, the family. No cameras, no press. Just us. To talk. To understand." King Charles arched an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "And you believe that will solve everything?" he asked. Meghan shook her head. "I believe it's a start," she corrected. "A chance to hear each other. To really listen. Not through the filter of the media. Not through the lens of public opinion. But as a family." The king considered this for a long moment, his gaze drifting back to the window. Outside, the gardens stretched out in perfect symmetry, untouched by the turmoil that simmered within the palace walls. "And you think Harry would agree to this?" he asked quietly, almost as if testing her resolve. Meghan's eyes brightened slightly, a flicker of hope crossing her features. "I know he would," she replied. "He's wanted this for a long time. We both have." King Charles's expression softened, if only for a moment. "I suppose I never really understood," he admitted, his voice heavy with reflection. "The pressures, the expectations. I thought I did, but clearly, I was wrong." Meghan nodded. "It's hard," she agreed. "It's harder than people realize. And I think if we could just talk, if we could just try to understand each other, maybe things could be different." The king studied her carefully, his eyes searching her face for any hint of insincerity. He found none. "And you're willing to do this?" he asked. "To truly sit down and talk. No barriers, no agendas. Just honesty." Meghan met his gaze unflinchingly. "I am," she replied. "If you are." King Charles looked away, his gaze once again fixed on the gardens beyond. There was a pause, a long, heavy silence that stretched between them. Outside, the sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across the palace grounds. It was as if time itself had slowed, waiting for his answer. Finally, he spoke. "I'll consider it," he said slowly, his voice low and measured. "But it has to be on my terms. No surprises. No more unannounced visits. If we are to do this, it must be done right." Meghan nodded, her expression resolute. "I understand," she replied. The king regarded her for a long moment, his gaze softening just slightly. "I appreciate your courage," he said finally, his voice almost gentle. "It takes something I never quite had. To walk in here like this. To ask for this." Meghan allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I know it wasn't easy to listen." King Charles nodded, his expression reflective. "I suppose we both have things to learn," he replied, almost to himself. For the first time since she had walked through the gates of Buckingham Palace, unannounced and unyielding, the tension in the room began to ease. The air felt lighter, the silence less oppressive. Meghan and King Charles sat there for a long while, neither speaking, both lost in their own thoughts. It was not a resolution, not by any stretch, but it was something. A beginning. And sometimes, a beginning was all that was needed. Outside the chamber, the whispers continued. Staff members exchanged glances of disbelief and hushed conversation. Word had spread quickly Meghan Markle had walked into Buckingham Palace without an invitation, and the king had agreed to speak with her. It was unheard of, unprecedented. Yet, it had happened. And the ramifications of that single act of defiance would ripple through the monarchy in ways no one could yet predict. The palace's communication team had already begun drafting statements, their fingers flying over keyboards as they prepared for the inevitable media storm. They knew, just as everyone else did, that this story would not remain confined to the walls of the palace for long. It would spread, and when it did, the world would watch. They always did. But for now, inside that room, it was just the two of them, King Charles and Meghan Markle, separated by walls of tradition and misunderstanding, but perhaps, just perhaps, united by a desire for something better, for a family that was whole, for a future that was different. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. As the heavy doors of the private chamber creaked open, the tension that had filled the room seemed to spill out into the ornate hallway, mingling with the whispers and hushed conversations of the palace staff. Meghan emerged first, her posture composed and expression carefully measured. Her eyes scanned the room with a calmness that belied the intensity of the conversation she had just left behind. Aides and secretaries glanced in her direction, their eyes wide with disbelief and curiosity. Meghan did not waver. She walked with purpose, head held high, as if the weight of what had just transpired rested solely on her shoulders, and she was determined not to buckle beneath it. Behind her, King Charles stepped out, his face a portrait of restraint. He moved slowly, deliberately, each step measured and dignified. He did not look at Meghan, nor did he acknowledge the scattering of staff members who bowed their heads respectfully as he passed. His gaze was fixed straight ahead, his expression unreadable. Yet, there was a subtle difference, a slight relaxation in his shoulders, a softening of the lines around his eyes. Whatever had been discussed in that room had not just been words, it had been something far more significant. A crack in the unyielding stone of tradition, perhaps. A flicker of understanding. The hallway fell silent as they passed, whispers dying on parted lips. Meghan's heels clicked softly against the polished marble floor, each step echoing through the grand corridor. King Charles walked behind her, the distance between them symbolic and real. It spoke of years of division, of misunderstanding, and of unspoken hurt. Yet, there was also a sense of possibility, fragile and tentative, but present nonetheless. Meghan reached the grand staircase first, pausing at the top as if waiting for some invisible signal. King Charles stopped a few paces behind her, his hands clasped behind his back in that familiar stance of authority. He did not speak, but his gaze softened just slightly as he watched her descend the steps, her movements graceful and deliberate. There were no words of farewell, no parting gestures, only silence. As she reached the landing, the grand doors of Buckingham Palace swung open, and the crisp London air spilled in, cool and invigorating. Meghan paused for just a moment, glancing back up the staircase where King Charles still stood, his figure framed by the gilded walls and opulent chandeliers. Their eyes met briefly, just a flicker, a mere second of acknowledgement, before Meghan turned and walked out into the courtyard, the doors closing behind her with a gentle but resolute finality. Outside, the world was waiting. Reporters and photographers had gathered just beyond the gates, their cameras poised, their questions ready to fire. The tension in the crowd was electric, a palpable anticipation simmering just beneath the surface. Meghan moved gracefully toward the waiting car, ignoring the shouted questions and flashing lights. Her expression remained calm, her posture unyielding. She did not stop to speak, did not glance back. The car door swung open, and she slid inside, the tinted windows concealing her from view. Moments later, the car pulled away from the palace gates, leaving behind a flurry of speculation and disbelief. Back inside the palace, King Charles remained at the top of the staircase, his gaze fixed on the doors through which he had just departed. An aide approached cautiously, his footsteps soft against the carpeted floor. "Your Majesty," he began tentatively, "shall we prepare a statement?" King Charles did not turn. His eyes were still fixed on the grand entrance, his mind lingering in the echoes of their conversation. Finally, he nodded, almost absently. "Yes," he replied, his voice low and thoughtful. "But not yet. Not yet." The aide bowed his head respectfully and retreated, leaving the king alone in the vast hallway, the silence stretching out like a shadow. He stood there for a long time, unmoving, his hands still clasped behind his back. Outside, the clouds shifted, casting fleeting shadows across the manicured gardens of Buckingham Palace. For the first time in a long while, King Charles allowed himself to simply be still, to reflect. The palace buzzed with speculation. In every corner, aides and secretaries whispered hurriedly, exchanging glances of disbelief and concern. Meghan Markle had walked unannounced through the gates of Buckingham Palace, met privately with the king, and then departed as quietly as she had come. It was an act so unprecedented that many struggled to grasp its significance. Had it been a confrontation? A plea for reconciliation? A political maneuver? No one knew, and those who were brave enough to ask found their questions met with silence. In the days that followed, the press speculated wildly. Headlines blared from every newsstand and digital screen. Meghan confronts King Charles an unannounced visit. Palace in shock. Markle walks through the gates without warning. Theories ranged from reconciliation attempts to strategic power plays. Pundits dissected her body language, analyzed every step, every gesture. Experts weighed in, claiming insight into royal protocol and speculating on what the breach meant for the monarchy. The world was captivated, and the palace remained silent. But behind the gilded gates, the royal family was anything but silent. Meetings were held behind closed doors, discussions whispered in private chambers, and advisors worked overtime to strategize the best path forward. King Charles, for his part, was more contemplative than ever. His usual routine was disrupted by long stretches of solitude, his mind replaying the conversation with Meghan over and over. Her words lingered, sharp, honest, unfiltered. Words that he could not simply dismiss. It was 3 days after the unannounced visit when King Charles finally summoned his most trusted advisors. They gathered in the king's private study, a room lined with towering shelves of leather-bound volumes and portraits of past monarchs. The air was heavy with the scent of polished wood and aged parchment. King Charles stood by the window, his back to the room as they filed in, each taking their place around the long oak table. When the last of them had settled, he turned to face them, his expression firm. "We need to talk," he began, his voice steady. "About what happens next." The advisors exchanged glances, their expressions careful and measured. It was not often that the king spoke with such directness, and even less often that he did so without first consulting a pre-written script. This was raw, unpolished, and they listened intently. King Charles continued, his gaze sweeping the room. "Meghan came here for a reason," he said. "And regardless of how unexpected or unorthodox her arrival was, she made points that cannot be ignored. I intend to meet with her again. And with Harry." The room fell silent. A few advisors shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting toward one another for reassurance. Finally, one of them spoke. "Your Majesty," he began carefully, "are you certain that's wise? Given everything that has happened, the interviews, the headlines, the accusations?" King Charles met his gaze directly. "That is precisely why it must happen," he replied. "We have allowed this to fester long enough. We have hidden behind statements and protocols, and it has cost us dearly. If there is any chance at all, to bridge this divide, we must take it." The advisors exchanged uncertain glances, but none spoke against him. King Charles's expression softened, just slightly. "The monarchy has survived wars, rebellions, and centuries of change," he continued. "But it cannot survive division from within. Not like this." There was a long pause before one of the senior aides nodded respectfully. "As you wish, Your Majesty," he said quietly. The others murmured their agreement, some more reluctant than others, but none objected. King Charles turned back to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. Outside, the garden stretched on in perfect symmetry, untouched by the chaos of the world beyond. He took a long breath, his gaze steady. "Prepare the arrangements," he said finally. "We begin again." The news of King Charles's decision to meet with Meghan and Harry sent ripples of shock through the palace corridors and far beyond its gilded walls. Buckingham Palace, known for its rigid adherence to tradition and unwavering protocols, was preparing for something unprecedented, a direct, unmediated dialogue aimed at reconciliation. For decades, the monarchy had been a fortress of formality, its members speaking through advisors and carefully drafted press statements. But now, the king himself had decided to bridge the chasm, and the implications of that choice were seismic. Inside the palace, preparations began in earnest. Private secretaries coordinated with senior aides, their movements brisk and purposeful. Meeting rooms were assessed for privacy, security protocols were reviewed and enhanced, and arrangements were quietly made to ensure that the gathering would remain undisclosed to the media until it was concluded. For the palace staff, the notion of Harry and Meghan returning, even temporarily, was both unsettling and exhilarating. Some whispered that it was a desperate attempt at damage control, while others speculated that it was a genuine attempt at reconciliation. No one knew for sure, and those closest to the king maintained their silence. In the days leading up to the meeting, King Charles retreated into quiet reflection. His schedule, typically brimming with royal duties and state obligations, was noticeably lighter, leaving him long stretches of solitude in his private quarters. He walked the gardens at dawn, his footsteps slow and deliberate as if each step carried the weight of history upon his shoulders. The palace grounds were serene in the early morning light, untouched by the frenetic energy of the staff who would soon fill its halls. It was during one of these dawn walks that Queen Camilla found him, her footsteps soft against the dewy grass. She approached with the grace that had come to define her presence, her expression gentle but concerned. "You've been out here quite a lot lately," she observed, her voice soft and measured. King Charles did not turn immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the horizon where the first rays of sunlight peeked through the clouds, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns. "A lot to think about," he replied simply. Camilla stepped closer, her hands folded neatly in front of her. "This meeting," she began carefully, It's quite a step. Are you sure it's the right one?" King Charles finally turned to face her, his eyes weary but resolute. "What choice do I have?" he asked gently. "The division has grown too deep. If it isn't addressed now, I fear it never will be." Camilla studied him for a long moment, her eyes softening. "You've always been the one to bridge gaps," she said quietly, "even when others wouldn't. It's one of your greatest strengths." He smiled faintly at that, the lines around his eyes crinkling slightly. "I don't know if it's strength," he admitted. "Maybe it's just stubbornness. But I have to try. For the family. For the future." Camilla nodded, her expression thoughtful. "If anyone can do it, it's you," she replied, her voice filled with quiet conviction. King Charles turned back to the horizon, his hands clasped behind his back. "I hope you're right," he murmured. The day of the meeting arrived with an air of nervous anticipation. Staff members moved with quiet urgency, double-checking security details and ensuring that the private room selected for the gathering was prepped and secure. Heavy velvet drapes were pulled across the tall windows, muffling the sunlight and casting the room in a soft, muted glow. The long mahogany table, polished to a mirror-like shine, was set with a simple arrangement of fresh flowers, a touch of grace amid the gravity of the occasion. Meghan and Harry arrived through a side entrance, their presence deliberately concealed from the prying eyes of the press. The car that carried them moved swiftly through the gates, flanked by security vehicles that ensured their passage was both discreet and unimpeded. They stepped out of the car quietly, Meghan's hand lightly resting on Harry's arm as they approached the side door. A senior aide greeted them with a polite but reserved nod, his expression revealing nothing of the internal turmoil that their presence stirred. They were led through the winding corridors of Buckingham Palace, the grandeur of its halls echoing with every footstep. Meghan's gaze flickered over the opulent surroundings, ornate mirrors framed in gold, crystal chandeliers sparkling overhead, and centuries-old portraits watching silently as they passed. It was a world she had once been part of, a world she had left behind, and now, a world she was re-entering under circumstances that were anything but ordinary. When they reached the appointed room, the aide stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. Meghan and Harry exchanged a brief glance, an unspoken exchange of resolve, before stepping through the door. The room was expansive but intimate, its walls lined with thick, leather-bound books and portraits of monarchs long gone. A grand fireplace stood at one end, unlit but imposing, its marble mantel polished to perfection. King Charles was already there, standing by the window with his back to them. The sound of the door closing seemed to echo for miles. For a moment, there was only silence, stretching out heavy and unbroken. Finally, King Charles turned, his expression measured and composed. "You're here," he said simply. Harry nodded, his posture straightening. "We are," he replied, his voice steady. The king motioned to the seats by the long table. "Shall we?" he asked, his tone polite but guarded. They moved to the table, settling into the high-backed chairs that creaked slightly beneath their weight. For a moment, none of them spoke. It was as if they were each waiting for the other to make the first move, to break the silence that had stretched between them for far too long. King Charles was the first to speak. "I want you to understand," he began slowly, his gaze steady. "This meeting isn't about accusations or blame. It's about understanding. It's about finding a way forward." His eyes flickered briefly to Harry, then to Meghan. "If we are going to bridge this gap, it has to start here. With honesty. With truth." Meghan nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "That's all I've ever wanted," she replied quietly. "To be heard. To be understood." King Charles's expression softened slightly, though the tension in his shoulders remained. "Then let's begin," he said, his voice steady but edged with determination. "Let's talk." And so they did. Words that had been left unspoken for years spilled into the room, raw and unfiltered. There were moments of tension, voices raised in passion and frustration, but also moments of understanding, of clarity that had been long denied. Harry spoke of his struggles, of the feeling of isolation that had plagued him since childhood. Meghan shared her perspective, her confusion, her hurt, her longing for acceptance. King Charles listened, sometimes silently, sometimes with gentle rebuttals, but always with a resolve to understand. Hours slipped by unnoticed, the hands of the grand clock on the far wall spinning quietly as the conversation deepened. Outside, the palace continued its routine, unaware of the fragile attempt at reconciliation unfolding within its walls. Inside, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, there was honesty, not filtered through the lenses of the media or whispered through palace corridors, but real, unvarnished truth. When the conversation finally lulled, there was a stillness that settled over the room. It was not quite peace, not yet, but it was something. It was a beginning, fragile and tentative, but real. King Charles stood first, his hands resting on the edge of the table. "I'm glad you came," he said quietly. "This was overdue." Harry nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It was," he replied simply. Meghan glanced between them, a flicker of hope softening her features. "Maybe this can be the start of something different," she said gently. King Charles's gaze met hers, and for the first time that afternoon, he smiled, a small, tentative gesture, but genuine. "Maybe it can," he agreed. The room was silent, heavy with the echoes of words long overdue. King Charles stood by the window, his gaze drifting out over the meticulously manicured gardens of Buckingham Palace. The sunlight poured in through the tall windows, casting elongated shadows across the marble floor. Meghan and Harry remained seated, their expressions reflective, almost weary from the emotional toll of the conversation that had just unfolded. It was as if years of misunderstandings and grievances had been spilled out onto the polished surface of the mahogany table, raw and unfiltered. King Charles took a long, measured breath, his hands clasped behind his back as he stared out into the distance. "I'm not naive," he began, his voice soft but steady. "I know this. This won't be easy. The road back from where we've been. It's long, complicated." He turned to face them, his expression solemn. "But I'm willing to try, if you are." Harry straightened in his chair, his jaw set with determination. "I am," he replied firmly, his voice unwavering. He turned to Meghan, who met his gaze with a soft nod of affirmation. "We both are." A silence stretched between them, fragile but full of possibility. King Charles moved away from the window, his footsteps soft against the plush carpet as he approached the table. He took his seat across from them, folding his hands neatly in front of him. For the first time since the meeting had begun, there was a sense of equilibrium, a shared understanding that perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way forward. "We need to address the damage," King Charles said finally, his tone pragmatic. "Not just to the family, but to the institution, to the monarchy." His eyes drifted between Harry and Meghan, measuring their reactions. "The world has watched us fracture. They've seen the headlines, the interviews, the accusations. And while you may feel justified in your actions, you must understand, it's not just about us. It's about the legacy of this family. It's about the stability of the monarchy. Meghan's expression softened slightly, but she did not look away. I understand that, she replied. But it's also about humanity. About being seen as people, not just symbols. That's all I ever wanted. For people to understand that we are human too. King Charles considered her words carefully. And yet, he countered gently. There are expectations. There is a role to play. It is not always kind. It is not always fair. But it is what has kept this institution standing for over 1,000 years. Meghan took a breath, her hands clasped together in her lap. But at what cost? She asked softly. At what cost do we continue to play these roles? At the expense of family? Of peace? Of happiness? The question lingered, suspended in the air like dust caught in sunlight. King Charles did not respond immediately. His gaze drifted to the portrait of Queen Elizabeth that hung prominently on the far wall. Her eyes, painted with regal grace, seemed to watch him, her gaze unwavering. He had inherited her legacy, one of steadfastness, of duty, of sacrifice. And yet, here he was, facing a new reality, one that did not fit neatly within the confines of tradition. I suppose, he said finally, his voice softening, I've always believed that sacrifice was part of the duty. That we give up certain liberties, so that the rest of the country may see something unyielding. Something constant. Harry leaned forward, his expression earnest. I understand that, he said gently. I grew up with that understanding. But I also grew up with the silence. The expectation that no matter what happened, we had to endure it. That we couldn't speak up. And I don't want that for my children. I don't want them to feel like they have to suffer in silence. That's why I left. That's why we did what we did. King Charles's gaze softened. Just SL. Harry paused, the question hanging heavily between them. He looked at Meghan, who gave him a reassuring nod. He turned back to his father, his expression resolute. I regret the way it happened, he admitted. I regret the hurt it caused. But I don't regret protecting my family. I don't regret choosing peace over tradition. The room fell silent once more, only the distant ticking of the grandfather clock punctuating the stillness. King Charles leaned back slightly, his hands still folded in front of him. I understand your perspective, he said finally. I truly do. But you must also understand mine. The monarchy is more than just a family. It's a symbol. It represents stability in a world that is constantly changing. And when that symbol is damaged, the consequences ripple far beyond these walls. Meghan's eyes flickered with empathy. I know, she said gently. But symbols are only as strong as the people behind them. If the family fractures, so does the symbol. We can't just pretend everything is perfect when it isn't. King Charles met her gaze evenly. Then what do you propose? He asked, his tone challenging but not unkind. If not tradition, if not silence, then what? Meghan took a deep breath, her eyes steady and clear. Honesty, she replied. Transparency. Showing people that even this family, this institution, is capable of change, of growth, that we are human too. The king considered her words, his expression contemplative. That's a bold proposition, he murmured. Meghan did not waver. It's a necessary one, she replied firmly. The world is changing. The monarchy has to change with it, or it risks being left behind. King Charles's gaze did not falter. And you believe that we can maintain our dignity, our strength, while doing that, he asked. Harry spoke this time, his voice steady and confident. I believe we can be stronger for it, he said. Imagine a monarchy that isn't just seen as untouchable, but relatable, accessible. One that people feel connected to, not distant from. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was reflective, as if all three were contemplating a future that had previously seemed impossible. King Charles leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting once more to the portrait of his mother. Her eyes, painted with such care and precision, seemed to watch him with quiet judgment. He wondered what she would say if she were here now, whether she would agree or chastise him for even entertaining the notion of change. After a long pause, he spoke. If we are to do this, he began slowly, it must be done correctly. There will be no half measures, no empty gestures. If we are to be transparent, then we must be fully committed. And that means you must be willing to come back, to face the scrutiny, to endure the questions, not just in interviews, but here, in England. Harry exchanged a glance with Meghan, his expression serious. We would be willing, he replied slowly. But it has to be different this time. No more silence. No more backroom deals. If we come back, we come back on our terms. Openly. Honestly. King Charles's gaze was unyielding. Then we must prepare for that, he replied. There will be meetings, press conferences, a formal address. We do this openly, or we do not do it at all. Meghan nodded, her eyes bright with determination. That's all I ever wanted, she said quietly. To be seen, to be heard, and for the truth to come out. King Charles studied them both carefully, his expression softening just slightly. Then I suppose, he said, his voice carrying the weight of history and hope, we have work to do. The room fell silent once more, but it was not the silence of tension or mistrust. It was the silence of possibility, of new beginnings forged from old wounds. Outside, the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the palace grounds. And for the first time in a long while, there was a sense of hope. Fragile, tentative, but undeniably real. The days that followed were marked by a quiet but unmistakable shift within the walls of Buckingham Palace.